Good evening. I'm Mel Chaffetz, member of the Foundation Board. I have to say, when we planned this, we were thinking, maybe Gil's got a couple friends. And when we discovered his mother knows everybody. But Gil is someone who grew up in Suffield 2 or 3 years ago, and subsequently went to school here and college, etc., and eventually moved out to San Francisco, where he lived for about 30 years, and was a banker investment guy. And then within the last year and a half or so, he moved back to Suffield. And so I've gotten to know him since then. And Gil's kind of a prolific writer. He's written 3 books. The first one was about loss, about emotional loss. And the second book is what we're going to talk about tonight. He's got a new book that came out recently on strategic planning, investment banking, etc. AI, something I know nothing about. But tonight we're going to talk about his second book, With Dance. And when I read the book over the year, it just brought back lots of memories. I'm Jewish, and I've read a lot about the Holocaust. I've read a lot about World War II, some about World War I. But I've never read about it from this perspective. He looks at it very differently than I've ever seen it before. Plus, as he'll tell, his family was involved in lots of ways. And I won't go too far with that. But I have to say, this past week, Beth and I, my wife, we had an opportunity to hear John Meacham, who spoke Tuesday night in Springfield. And if you ever get a chance, it was wonderful. And one of the things he said that struck a chord with me was, he was asked a question about young people today, what's going on, and he said, as compared to probably everybody here in the audience, not everybody, but most people in the audience, when we grew up, our homes were safe places. Our places of worship were safe. In my synagogue in Springfield, we've had police security for probably 15, 20 years. And our schools were safe. And as many of you know, I was a former elementary principal here in Suffield, and we spent time to set up protections for kids. So when Mr. Meacham said those things, it struck a chord with me. When I read Gil's book, it struck a chord with me. He and I chatted. I had an opportunity to chat with him about it, and the parallels were very disturbing to me. So I think you're going to be really intrigued by what he has to say. As I said, it's a different perspective, but enjoy it. Unfortunately, we couldn't get copies of the book for tonight.
No, they're here.
They came? Oh,
They're right there.
I apologize. We have copies for the book. And Gil will be glad to sign them for you. They must have just come today.
They did. Amazing.
So, without further ado, Gil Ahrens, our author.
Well, thank you, Mel. I'm honored and humbled. And, Mel, obviously you're all here because he was a principal and you guys had a chance to leave, but you didn't because you would have been in the doghouse if you had. But Mel has become a friend, and he has this avuncular aura about him. I don't have that. So, nor do I have a nice British accent that makes me sound smart. I don't have that either. So I might have to dim the lights because if you're inclined to go to sleep, then no one will know. Okay, just saying. But I do want to thank the Kent Memorial Library Foundation for having me. I understand there might be refreshments afterwards. I can thank the Childs for that, or the foundation for that. I have nothing other than what you're going to see here, but I do encourage questions. That's what this is all about, because sometimes we're in an age where we don't ask enough questions and we don't hear each other's responses openly. So I've got a presentation here. It's stupid. I was an investment banker for many years, and that's what I did. So bear with me, but I'm going to try to go through them very quickly. And the first thing I want to mention is that, okay, see, I'm technology challenged right now. Okay. November, it's a month of change. We've just had elections. Historically, there have been revolutions. There have been all kinds of disruptions. We've had government shutdowns. Hello? They happened kind of around this time of year. Just 10 years ago, today, Paris had a terrorist attack that killed 130 people. Starbucks is going on strike, right? It's November, that's what people do. And also in November, let us not forget that November 9th and 10th in 1938, there was this little event called Kristallnacht, right? November's a crazy month. But it also coincided with World War I. We had Veterans Day, so you have to be blind if you didn't see all the American flags in Suffield or on the town green, or if you went to any cemetery. There were hundreds, thousands of American flags for Veterans Day. But Veterans Day is really about commemorating the end of World War I, 11th hour on the 11th day, the 11th month of 1918. So this slide says, you can read it, I won't do it for you, but there was a belief before World War I that everything was great. The progress was great, technology, medicine, arts and sciences. Progress was inevitable, our leaders were trustworthy, our institutions were infallible, and we as a civilization were destined for greatness. I mean, there was just wonderful euphoria. And World War I shattered all of that. And one of the great examples of being shattered was the Battle of Verdun, right? Now, you probably heard about this, but imagine in one day, 1 million artillery shells dropped in one day in an area half the size of Suffield. And over the course of about 10 months in that battle, 50 million shells, so Suffield would have been churned over a few times, right? Verdun was eviscerated, right? And it shattered the illusion that the world was safe. So in November, okay, the Battle of Verdun was still going on while the Battle of the Somme ended, right? It'll be in a couple days. The Battle of the Somme is typically associated with trench warfare and all this craziness that we associate with World War I. Static trench warfare, just nothing happening except mindless killing. That started July 1st, 1916. On the first day of the Battle of the Somme, twice as many people who live in Suffield were killed, mostly Brits. All of Agawam was injured. Like, it was insane, right? So there are many people who say, and I'm one of them, that the 20th century didn't begin January 1st, 1900. It began July 16th, 2016, when the Battle of the Somme began. So there's a picture of Hawthorne Ridge in France. 30 tons of explosives went into this bunker that guys spent 6 months digging by hand to plant these explosives. And when they ignited about 7 in the morning, 85,000 tons of earth got out. That explosion, they say, was heard in London. which is kind of like if the bomb had gone off in Suffield, it would have been heard in Algonquin, Maine. Or if you like, Princeton, New Jersey, same thing, okay? So you saw these people on November 11th, the Brits, the Canadians, the Aussies, all wearing poppies, because they all commemorate this crazy war. And a lot of the poppies are really about this kind of guilt in some ways that the British especially faced when they told their troops at the Battle of the Somme, like, it's going to be okay for you guys to go over the top and rush the German trenches because a few days before we bombed the hell out of them, right? 1.5 million artillery shells were bombed at the German encampments. But the problem is, this is a misleading slide, 30% of that 1.5 million shells were duds. They didn't work. A third of those remaining shells were okay. They kind of did what they were supposed to. But 2/3 of them, the majority, were shrapnel. They did nothing, right? So the barbed wire was not impacted, the trenches weren't impacted, the encampments, the bunkers, nothing. So when the Brits were told to go over the top and go attack the Germans, they were just mowed down. They were slaughtered. So let me tell you about one of my mother's uncles, and I forgot to thank her for being here, because without you, without you I wouldn't be here, obviously. And nor would we be able to appreciate those fine refreshments afterwards. But this is our Uncle Carl, and my mother had this deep affection for Uncle Carl. And I grew up knowing him as Uncle Carl, right? I never knew him, he had died long ago. As I was researching this book, I came to realize, like, he was a badass, pardon my French, he was a big deal. He looked so kind and avuncular and gentlemanly in this picture. And you can see he was awarded what's called the Pour le Mérite. Sorry, I mispronounced that. Pour le Mérite, which is French. He's German. How did that work out? I'll get to that in a minute. But that was the highest military award anybody could receive in Germany, the Pour le Mérite. Now, in World War I, so he was in charge of the Kaiser Wilhelm II, his regiment guard. Kind of all the Prussian nobility was under his command, and he went from Berlin to Liège, first battle in Belgium. Then they rushed him over to Poland to the Eastern Front, and then back down to another portion in Galicia in the Eastern Front, then way back over here to the Battle of Champagne, up to Arras, and then he went back to the Eastern Front, but I tried to put it in Google Maps and it freaked out. It didn't want to do it. He was all over the place, right? And highly unusual, but that's what they did, right? It was a call to service, and that was kind of what people in my mother's family did. They were called, they served without question, without reservation, without condition. It was just automatic, right? Most of the people in my mother's family were in the military. It's just what they did, because they served under the Kaiser or Prince or someone where they had an obligation to protect those territories. And I'm going to get into more of the family history in a minute, so don't worry. Another uncle, General Friedrich, also has that Medal of Distinction. His was a little bit better because he got oak leaves, which is just a nice way of saying that he was a bigger badass. But he was in charge of serving as chief of staff for the army that was run by this fellow, with this very stylish hat. Right? I mean, who comes up with that? Seriously, but you probably would see that in, 20 years later, right, in abundance. But this guy, if you don't know, was the Crown Prince Wilhelm, the son of Kaiser Wilhelm. This Crown Prince was in charge of the army that was basically operational in the Battle of Verdun, right? And the Battle of Verdun was Germany's desire to wipe out the French. They thought if they could go to Verdun and attack the city of Verdun, which is a fortress city, that the French would defend it to their last drop of blood. And they all bled. The Germans, the French, everyone bled. And so my uncle Friedrich, together with the Crown Prince, went to these two fine fellows, those two guys, who were effectively the military dictators of Germany. The guy on the left, looking very, well, they both look stern with stylish mustaches, but the guy on the left is Erich Ludendorff, and the guy on the right, of course, is Paul von Hindenburg. Hindenburg was a hero of the war of the Franco-Prussian War. He was an icon. He was there as a figurehead, nothing more. Ludendorff ran the show, and they wanted these guys to settle for peace with the French and the Brits, and they said, no, we'll keep fighting. But of course, this is like 1917. Everybody, and remember, Germany had there'd been no conflict at all on German soil, zero. But the German people were starving to death because the Brits had blockades. So there was no food coming into Germany whatsoever. They were starving, they were suffering, and they all thought the war would be over in 3 months, and it's going on 4 years. So then, of course, the Americans come in, good old Woodrow Wilson, his 14 points, very aggressive, very punitive towards Germany. One might say rightly so. But what happened is they had this thing called the armistice, which is what we celebrated on Veterans Day a few days ago. But the armistice was not peace. All right, so a lot of what I'm talking about is my belief that we, the world, has still not recovered from World War I. It wasn't settled properly. It wasn't settled well. It was chaos. The world was undone. And more importantly, the trust of institutions, of leaders, of people, of culture was completely ruptured. So I call it the Great Rupture because everything that was once held true and dear, whether it was service or belief that culture was on the ascendance and that our duty was sacred or that our leaders were trustworthy, it was all blown up, just like Verdun. And a great example of this, which Etienne would know, before the Great War, this is a picture of Ypres in Belgium. Ypres was a gem of a city in the Middle Ages. It was wealthy. It was the capital of the cloth trade in Europe. And it was beautiful. It had this stunning cloth hall and this great, I think it's St. Martin's Cathedral. And of course, after the war, it was just in ruins. That's kind of how the psyche was for everybody who was involved in this. And yet, the German experience, as I said, Germany never had any conflict on its soil at all in World War I. But after the war, of course, it was isolated because the Treaty of Versailles made Germany a pariah. It had punitive reparations. It was still starving because the economy was in ruins. Humiliated, hyperinflation, and these little things called tariffs, they were abundant. And there was massive political confusion. The Kaiser had abdicated and had gone to exile in the Netherlands. It was a vacuum. So of course you had all these political parties sprout up, 160 or so, which, there was this little guy, it affected him deeply. And if you don't know who he is, he happens to, maybe you know him as the same guy. Yeah, cheeky little fellow. So let me tell you a little bit about my mother's family, the Schulenbergs. German, obviously. And yes, they were on the wrong side of that conflict, the Great War. But they tried to do the right thing, tried to uphold service and duty and all that. Nevertheless, the Schulenberg family could trace its roots still to this day all the way back to 1237, uninterrupted in writing, which is crazy to me, right? My mom and I, we were in Berlin for the 750th anniversary of that city's founding. And part of the members of the family were part of the founding members of Berlin. It's kind of cool. A couple early members, these fine fellows up here, were bishops, one from 1513, Christoph, I think a little bit later, 1700 or so. This guy in the middle, he's probably the most famous Schulenberg of all, and it's not because of his incredibly pronounced nose, right? He's got a wicked nose, but it's probably because Robert Plant of Led Zeppelin took his hairstyle after this guy. All right, I mean, look at that. That's some hair. But he's actually famous because he was a field marshal in Germany, and look, it wasn't like there were no wars before the Great War of 1914-18. There were lots of conflicts. He was involved in 10 battles in 15 years, right? And then he retired, and the Republic of Venice decided that they were feeling threatened by the Ottoman Turks. So they hired him as a mercenary to defend the Greek Isles against this Turkish invasion. And he won. Great. So they gave him this nice little palazzo here in Venice on the Grand Canal. They just gave it to him. It's still there. It's very famous. It's now a hotel that no one, I'm sure, if we collected all of our money, we could not afford it at one night. It's just stupid expensive. But there's a statue of him in Corfu, which is a Greek island. And he was a big deal, right? Well, his nephew, which is this fellow here, with another nice nose, I'm just saying, General Adolf Friedrich, he served and was a general under Frederick the Great, but also Frederick the Great's father, who was Frederick the First, and Frederick the Great was actually the second. And he served with distinction for many years. And he served with such distinction that Frederick the First gave him this nice little shack. And it was called the Palace Schulenberg, right? Why was it called Palais? And just like, why was that medal the Pour le Mérite in French? Because Frederick the Great, this guy, everyone in his court had to speak French because he loved France. And then it's ironic that the Great War is this conflict between Germany and France. It's just nuts, right? You can't make it up. But don't feel so unfortunately, Adolf Friedrich really didn't live long enough to spend much time in this little ramshackle cottage because Frederick the Great sent him into battle in Silesia and was killed. It just happened. But don't feel sorry, because his wife inherited this place with her 16 children. And we'll come back to Wolfsburg. It still exists. Okay? But this place, Palais Schulenberg, that was built by my mother's ancestor, my ancestor, eventually became the Reich Chancellery, which is like the White House. And so this gentleman here is Otto von Bismarck. He lived there, he ruled there, he governed from there. And then this guy we met before, Paul von Hindenburg, lived there, governed there, and had his seat of office there. And then this guy, he lived there too. Now, he assumed power kind of in 1933, but he was on the ascension long before that, right? Berlin was a very different place. It was the artistic capital of Germany, it was the cultural capital, it was the intellectual capital, it was the liberal capital, right? They were cynical, sarcastic, and funny and witty, and they just thought they were better, for better or worse. But they would say things about Hitler like this, and I'll translate. He's a parade puppet in brown, right? The brown shirts, right? That's the Sturmabteilung. That was just thugs giving a job to make people miserable. The next one is Hitler promises to make Germany great. How? With his height? Because he was, And the next one is Hitler? He'll go away. He'll be a passing fad. That was what people were saying to each other openly in Berlin. Well, then, of course, he goes from the corporal to the dictator pretty quickly, right? Hindenburg was dying. He thought if we just make Hitler chancellor, we can control him and we'll be okay. Well, look at this. He gets appointed chancellor January 30th of 33. Not even a month later, there's this Reichstag fire, which is the parliament building in Germany, which still is a mystery how it got set, right? There's a conspiracy. Some people say it was a communist. Other people, more likely, say Hitler had somebody set it on fire. Doesn't matter. The next day, he says, I'm declaring martial law. We're having an enabling act, which means I can do whatever I want as your chancellor, as your dictator, to stem the tide of communism, of these radical leftists or rightists, whatever they might be, and I've got you. I'm going to control things and put law and order in place. And oh, by the way, if we maybe have some civil liberties infractions, it's a minor detail, okay? So then a couple months after that, there's this little thing called the book burning, which in Berlin attracted 40,000 people. All right, and this is like from an intellectually curious, sophisticated city. 40,000 people attending a book burning party is kind of crazy. And I'm going to make a time out here to make a local comment. I understand that there's a book controversy or discussion in the library. Let kids read books. It doesn't matter what they are. It doesn't matter what they are. Because, one, nobody reads anymore. So if a kid wants to read a book, any book, God bless them. But there's this little rectangular contraption that is dying to trap our brain in addictive narcissism. If we can remove this for a few minutes and put a book in someone's hands, I don't care what they read, right? It just activates the brain in a way this thing will never do. Okay, that's my commercial. But the next thing that happened very shortly thereafter is the Night of the Long Knives. And you guys probably heard of this, but hundreds of people were murdered. Threats to Hitler, and so many people that my mom's family knew and were friends with were murdered, like just because they were in the way of Hitler. And so that's how we consolidated power. So then, really, instead of saying things like this and mocking Hitler in public, people in Berlin would say this privately to each other so that no one else could hear. And this translates into, are you still alive? Like, it would be, what a surprise. How nice to see you. You're still alive. Because everybody was getting killed. So then Hitler got busy. Decided to make stuff. Like, build stuff. Make Germany great. This is not politics, I swear. But no, people were still starving and hungry and needing work. And so he gave them bread and beer to build the Autobahn. There were no cars to drive on it, but that would soon change because Hitler had a plan for how to populate the Autobahn. But he got busy again. In 1935, the image on the left here, sorry, on your right, is the Ministry of, the Air Force Ministry, right, in Berlin. The largest building in the world at the time. It was insane, it was huge, like 2 million square feet. This other one is the Congress Hall in Nuremberg, not to be confused with the parade grounds and all that nonsense. But it's a massive structure, that's what he did. In Berlin, Tempelhof Airport, and of course the Olympiastadion, which Germany held, 1936 Olympics, right? He finished this in time for the Olympics, right? The pace of construction was insane. 1937, he had needs to build the auto factory, but he needed the land first. So he decided to have a contract or discussion with the owner of this fine place, which was my great uncle, and it was then consummated, right? Favorable conditions to the government, let's say. Then the next year they built the factory. That's what they did. 5,000 acres with a river and plenty of land, and you build a factory because someone gives you a good deal on it. And they had no choice. And then the next year, 1939, instead of tearing down the old Reich Chancellery, they just kind of added onto it. So this is the new Reich Chancellery, kind of like the new East, another side. But it was a massive building. It was huge, right? And these buildings, and by the way, this thing got done in just under a year. There were something like 8,000 workers who built this thing 24/7. It's insane how they did this. Okay, so something that I've heard my relatives say is Hitler was not our fault, but he's now our responsibility. And it wasn't just my families that said that. A lot of people said that. They just had to be quiet about it. So let me introduce you to one of my great uncles, Friedrich Werner von der Schulenburg. So he was in the Great War, Battle of the Marne, but he had diplomatic posts all over the world. But his important posts were as ambassador to Iran, Romania, and the Soviet Union. And by the way, the commonality of all those, oil. Germany needed oil, right? Because they're still trying to rebuild the economy that had been decimated after the Great War. So he was very good at what he did, and he was so good, in fact, that his station in Persia, or Iran, you can't really see this, but this is his name inscribed here, which is the Gate of Xerxes, or it's also called the Gate of All Nations, in the ancient Persian ruins of Persepolis. That was built in 500 BC. So it's a great honor, right? And there he is, because he was the German ambassador to the Soviet Union. Not an easy post, but an important one, because Hitler needed to have the Soviet Union put at bay, right? Appeased. So here he is, and he's standing next to Stalin. The guy signing that is Vyacheslav Molotov of Molotov cocktail fame. And the guy behind him is Ribbentrop, who is a total dunce, but we're not going there. But part of this pact was also an agreement to carve up Poland. Poland didn't fare well in any of this. We'll go back to that. Fritz Dietloff is another family relative who's actually probably more famous than Friedrich Werner because he was very involved politically, very involved militarily, even though he never served in the military. he knew everybody. He was probably more of a pacifist than most people at that time, in large part because he saw what had happened during the Great War, and he had a front row seat because this was his father, General Friedrich. General Friedrich, as I said, was a badass. This guy served with distinction everywhere, and he had also been a military attaché in London before the Great War. He was very international. He spoke fluent French, he spoke fluent English, and he'd served as chief of staff as with the highest of distinction, right? And as I said, he won the Pour le Mérite with oak leaves. And I just love saying his name, Friedrich Bernhard Karl Gustav Ulrich Erich Graf von der Schulenburg. It just rolls off the tongue, kind of like a jelly donut. And just as an aside, my mother's passport, when she first got it, she's going to hate me for saying this, but I remember going overseas, and the customs guy is looking at her passport, which reads, Christina, Martha, Ilse, Ingeborg, Gräfin von der Schulenburg, Ahrens. And the guy's like, well, who are you? Who are you? Anyway, so Friedrich, he served with distinction for many years, and when he died in May of 1939, Hitler went to the funeral. So this guy is Fritz Dietloff, his son. This guy is the little munchkin. This guy is Heinrich Himmler. And you know, they're all dressed in the black SS uniforms, and the war hadn't started yet. Okay? There's no war yet. But they're all dressed like it's coming, and it is, and they all know it. And by the way, if you don't know the black uniforms of the SS, that doesn't stand for stormtroopers. It's just Hitler's personal bodyguard, basically. But everybody knew that war was coming, right? Because there had also been Kristallnacht, right? And so Fritz Dietloff, who was a pacifist, who was really well connected, this wasn't gonna stand. His father had served for so many years in the military for failed campaigns, for failed leaders, for failed decisions, for flawed thinking. He wasn't gonna let Germany go down the tubes like it had during World War I. It was just repeating itself again. So he was part of a small group of people who, over too long a time, it turns out, but they enlisted this guy. If you don't know this guy, you may have seen a movie starring this guy. That's Tom Cruise playing Klaus von Stauffenberg, who's that guy, all right? And Operation Valkyrie was a bomb plot designed to kill Hitler. And they failed. And that's the after fact, but they failed. And what happened is, it wasn't just a few people that were implicated in this. There were hundreds of people involved and exposed, not only from this plot, but from many, many, many others. This was not the first attempt to kill Hitler. There were lots, but this was the most famous because it was called the Generals Plot. These were aristocratic generals who put their lives on the line to try to kill their leader because they thought their leader was betraying everything they held dear. And if they didn't do something, they would all go in ruins. So a fraction, there's so many, but here's a list, if you can see, there were admirals and generals and field marshals and ambassadors and lawyers and 6 priests and pastors. And the most common, the suicide, they didn't die by suicide, they were given a gun, right? Shoot yourself or we'll shoot you. But most of them were killed by hanging. And not the civilized hanging with a nice knotted rope. It was a hanging where there's a meat hook, and then they hung piano wire, what the mafia does, and they hung them that way. And Hitler filmed it. He filmed those people being hung that way. Just saying. One of those guys was Dietrich Bonhoeffer. And if you don't know Dietrich Bonhoeffer, He was a marvelous Christian pastor. He was in prison for 2 years. He wrote a book in prison called The Cost of Discipleship. Doesn't matter what religious belief you might have, it is phenomenal. And this is one of my favorite quotes of his. When Christ calls a man, he bids him come and die. And that was kind of relevant and germane to the times that they were in. So he was known to my family, and including my grandfather and grandmother. And my book goes into much more detail about the two of them because it's an amazing story. My grandfather was also involved in the conspiracy. He was in jail, he was in prison, he was tortured, but for some reason he wasn't executed. And I'm not sure why. He was sent on a suicide mission, and he was, I don't know if he was shot down or if his plane ran out of fuel, but he died over the Vistula in Poland. His remains were never found. Just like his father's remains were never found in World War I. His father was killed in the Battle of the Somme. Never found. Right, so many people in the Great War were never found. So that's why if you ever go there are so many gravestones that Rudyard Kipling wrote, known unto God. Right? We don't know who they are. We could never find their remains, but God knows them. Known unto God. So, yes, that's my grandmother also. She was quite charming. And I kind of believe that Uncle Carl introduced them. It's still a little intrigue, but Uncle Carl was my mother's favorite uncle because he was so cool. But here's a letter that the Kaiser Wilhelm wrote to him from the Netherlands, thanking him for his 50 years of service. All right, 27 uninterrupted years serving the Kaiser. But I think there's something that maybe, because he kind of adopted my grandfather, who was orphaned, and so maybe that's why he wasn't executed. I don't know, but it's a mystery. My grandmother, she was remarkable, and I got to know her, which was an amazing blessing. She was a business owner, and she somehow managed to make money at a time when women weren't supposed to. Women weren't, supposed to run businesses. They weren't supposed to be entrepreneurial. She just did it because she had to. She also wrote crossword puzzles, and so I don't know if she did it for the money, but she went into the newspaper office in Berlin, I think because it gave her access to information. Her husband's business partner was Jewish. One day he went missing. And then a couple years later, her husband went missing. So working at a newspaper, you get information flow. But it also prompted my great-grandmother to harbor Jews in her basement, in her townhouse in Berlin. And I'll always remember my mother saying that, if there was any threat that the police or somebody was coming, my great-grandmother would take her cane, and she didn't need it, but it was a fashion statement. She would stamp on the floor, right, 3 times, signaling for the people in the basement to be quiet, because there was company coming. And we don't know whatever happened to the people in her basement. We just don't know, because when the Russians were coming into Berlin and everybody was fleeing, it was kind of everyone for themselves, right? So no one knows. But there my grandparents got married, very dashing couple, and that's my grandmother, and the little girl is my mother. Look at that. Now, one of the misconceptions, though, I will say, and I experienced this growing up in a small town, and there was still, I mean, she experienced a little anti-German hostilities when she came to this country right after the war. It was not a good thing to be German, right? I experienced a little bit of that too, not like she did. But when there was this belief that, oh my God, your mom's a countess, you must be rich and you grew up in a castle, blah, blah, blah. Well, yeah, there was a castle associated with her family. This was her father's castle. Her father never lived in it. He couldn't afford it. This castle was built in 1448. And my grandfather never, I mean, maybe he set foot in it a few times to make sure that the caretakers and the current, renters were taking care of it, but he never lived there. My mother never lived there. I thought they did. It's funny, when as a kid, I thought, oh, how cool, you lived in this castle. She never did. This castle, oh, by the way, this castle here, it was taken over by the East German government after World War II, and it was used as a training ground for the East German military. Why not? Why not? This place is still in existence. So this is that place, Wolfsburg, I talked to you about, and that was at one point the headquarters of Volkswagen, and then it became a museum. But Ferdinand Porsche, he designed the first Volkswagen, so he hung out here quite a bit, right? There's still some, was he or wasn't he a Nazi? Everybody was a Nazi, right? You had to be a Nazi if you wanted to buy bread. You had to have a Nazi card to show that you were trustworthy. So even if you didn't want to be a Nazi, you kind of had to be a Nazi, right? So the Nazi was just a party. It wasn't a stigma. It just was what you had to do to survive. And so why did I call this book A Delicate Dance? I hope it's kind of obvious, but the world changed so dramatically over a very short amount of time. It went from being one where you could trust anybody, anything, and the world was safe, to suddenly just surviving required some nimbleness and some dexterity and a little adaptability in a world where nothing was trustworthy. And no one was trustworthy. Where if you asked someone if they were still alive, you couldn't trust if they were going to turn you in. So I'm hoping that that's just a sliver of interest, and I will take any questions or any criticism you may have. Yes, sir.
Von Schulenburg, if I understand correctly, means from a place called Schulenburg.
Not quite.
Is there a town, Schulenburg?
There is. So the question is, von der Schulenburg means it's from a place called Schulenburg. That would be a correct literal translation, what it means today. But the family's so old that the actual Schulen in its vernacular back then, when the family was created, means to look out. So it was literally to look out over a burg was a castle. Right, so it was also vernacular for a castle back then. So it was looking out over a castle, so it implies protection. So the family's always been of the mentality and the mindset of being protective. Great question.
Can you describe the crest on this house, why it looks like it does?
So yeah, the question is, can I describe the crest and the coat of arms? Because it looks nice? No, I think, so the claws are the talons of a falcon, I believe. These talons here. There is a crown, because why not? Everybody has to have a crown. But this particular coat of arms is for my mother's family, right? My mother's branch. So the Schulenburg family in Germany has lots of different branches, So the castle that my grandfather owned was one branch. The Wolfsburg branch was another branch. There are many different branches, and they all have their different coat of arms. And how they get created is whoever spends enough money with the right artist probably hits the bid. Yes, sir.
So, Schulenburg, what part of Germany are we talking about? Is it Eastern Germany or Western Germany?
Yeah, so the question is, what part of Germany is the Schulenburg family from? And mostly Prussia. So mostly Eastern, Northeastern, but again, it's a big family, and so there were a few branches in Bavaria, a few branches in Schleswig-Holstein, but mostly Prussia. And so that's when I said the family kind of originated out of Berlin, like very military, Brandenburg, right? So that's really the center of gravity. Yeah.
So you said that this has been with you throughout your life, and you felt for a long, long time that this could be a potential major work for you, right? So as you started moving forward with the project itself early on, were there any particularly strikingly memorable moments of discovery? I'm sure there are a lot, but are there a couple of them that you can highlight for us that were particularly revealing or surprising or just amazing to you?
Yeah, so the question is, did I really learn and get revelation that I hadn't known before in doing this project? And honestly, it was, in some ways, the great extent to which World War I impacted the family, and the extent to which a couple of these relatives were so involved. Like, I really didn't know that. I knew that they were important people. So much of my growing up was about how devastating World War II was, but then researching their lives and their careers, I got a whole new perspective about the devastation of World War I. And so that to me just changed everything. Because World War II is awful. But it wouldn't have happened if World War I hadn't ended so tragically, and if it just hadn't happened. I mean, it was an awful experience, and again, I think we're still trying to recover from it.
You traveled a lot to Germany to write your book?
So the question is, did I travel a lot to Germany to write the book? Not enough. I've been there a few times, but not enough. But I will say the few times I've been, it's memorable, it's impactful, because even in Berlin, which was decimated, right, from the bombings and everything, there are still buildings intact where there are pockmarks and bullet holes and everything. And there's an essence, a smell in the air that is unmistakable, right? And it's a visceral experience. And we still have family there. I was in Frankfurt there a couple of years ago. And that's part of the reason I call it a delicate dance also. The family still clings to its traditions, yet in a modern world that doesn't care about those traditions, right? And so it tries to have a sense of pride and honor in a world that really could care less. And it's, Mel and I were talking this morning about the John Meacham discussion, and it just made me cry, because to me a culture is defined by how it treats its children, and we're kind of failing. But to answer your question, I love Germany, but it's a tough place to visit. It's hard, as I'm sure you can appreciate. I'm sorry? How did World War I start? The question is, how did World War I start? Jimmy Coggins knows, but it was.
Anything in Serbia?
Well, that was the event that got everything going. But you have to remember, like, all these countries, the Germans, the Russians, the French, the Brits, they were all intermarried, right? Like, Crown Prince Wilhelm's grandmother was Queen Victoria, right? Kaiser Wilhelm's mother was Queen Victoria. And his brother was Tsar Nicholas, right, the second or whatever. So they all knew each other. They all spoke English, for goodness sakes. So how did it start? It's still a great mystery. It's kind of like, I guess, what they say, going bankrupt. It happens very slowly and then all at once. It was like this chess match that everyone's trying to call each other's bluff, and then nobody did. And so then it became this great romantic adventure to go to war, right? So honestly, it's
The killing of the Crown Prince.
the spark was the killing of the Archduke or whatever in Sarajevo. Yeah, Ferdinand. But that was an excuse.
Right.
But it people were just itching for a fight. Honestly, they had all this technology, all these armaments, and change was brewing in the air, and it just happened. That's bad excuse. And so the question is, there's so much guilt, remorse, and mixed emotions about what had happened. Is that right? And how did my mom's family react to all that? I think with devastation. And one of the reasons, so again, I should have explained this earlier, the Delicate Dance title really came from when my mother would visit Uncle Carl, and Uncle Carl's wife Ella would give my mother dancing lessons, because there was still hope somehow that maybe the monarchy would be reinstated. And Lord knows, a countess needs to know how to ballroom dance, right? But metaphorically, also know how to dance in a world that is being disrupted, right? But I think to the question of responding and reacting to the atrocities, everyone was heartbroken. Everybody was heartbroken that nobody in my mother's family, at least, nobody believed that Germany could do this, like with the Holocaust. It was like, how is that possible? This was a country that had Goethe and Beethoven and science and literature and everything that had high arts and accomplishment and refinement, and then they do this? Like, how is that possible? So there's a lot of kind of disbelief, I think, and then a lot of shame. And honestly, the guilt of Germany still exists today, as it should, right? But I think that's also one of the reasons that my grandmother really pushed to come to this country, because she was an only child who was born at the end of World War I. My mother was an only child who was born at the beginning of World War II. She had seen like the devastation that had occurred from utter mismanagement, like terrible leadership, terrible decisions, and a country that had just fallen on top of itself. And my grandmother said, no, we've got to get out of here and go to the new land, because Germany is in ruins. And she made a choice.
Why Springfield?
Because the question is, why Springfield? My grandmother found her way to Frankfurt. So my grandmother was very smart and very pretty. She spoke English, French, German, and she found a job working as a translator with a U.S. intelligence officer. And somehow they managed to get married. Right? My grandmother knew how to win the favor of anybody she wanted. So that was kind of their ticket out. That's a great question. So the question is, my great-grandmother's father had invented vending machines, right? And that's how he made money. But then when the World War I came around, like, no one's going to eat chocolate. They were selling chocolate out of the vending machine, and she kind of repositioned the company to make components for artillery and weapons of mass destruction, basically. And that's how they made their money, right? But the question is, some of the investors and the processes and all the mechanisms behind all of that, that's a way too involved answer to give you right now. I apologize. But I can talk with you offline about it.
Was it with Crop?
What's that?
Crop.
Krupp. Yeah. Well, they sold to Krupp.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
And others.
Crop was like seriously horrible.
Yeah.
Terribly involved in war.
Absolutely. Well, war crimes, war profiteering, everybody did what they had to do to survive. But at some point, yes, people cross the line. It's just a matter of knowing where the line is sometimes. And in war, no one knows.
Well, yeah, if you come from like the edge or like those places, they know very well about Crop.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It was devastating. Yeah. Any more questions? Because I know we have refreshments waiting somewhere. And I am happy to talk to anybody offline or what have you. And there are books. God knows there are books. So thank you all for coming. I appreciate it.